Now, to get a full background on creating a TSEP or a Tekla Structures Extension Package, you can actually do a search online or go to the Tekla Developer Center, and there's this really comprehensive article that shows you everything that you need to know. Now, this is quite technical and quite involved, but I'm going to show some of the basic steps, and I've got a template for the TSEP folder structure here to create those that I'm going to be using in this example to sort of expedite the process. But really, if you go through this is going to kind of go through all of the things that you need to know and understand to build those TSEP packages. Okay, so I'm going to open up the File Explorer here for where my Visual Studio project is, and I'm going to paste in a TSEP template that I've already created and I use on all my applications. Now, this is a great way to show you how to organize and create a template and then just follow this structure here to rapidly deploy your applications. Now, when I go inside of that TSEP, you'll see that there's a structure of a series of subfolders. The starting point is actually down here on the bottom with this TSEP installer. And inside of there, there's this TSEP Definition XML file. And if I actually double click on that and just choose Visual Studio here to open that file, I can say just once or always. I'm going to go ahead and say always. That will open this XML file up, and there's a few things that we want to change. The first thing is that this has a full structure based on what you would see in that documentation. And I'm actually using the TSEP version 2.0. Now, why am I using that versus the earlier version? What's the key difference? The big thing is that it uses recursive folders structure, right? And so what that means is that if I actually go back in here and I go up one level, what it's doing is instead of me having to define every single file that is in the installation path for like all my macros and for my executable and any libraries that I'm referencing, basically what this version 2.0 does is it just searches through the folders and it grabs all the subfolders and any files and contents automatically or recursively in those subfolders. So that's why you want to use this style here of version 2.0. And you're going to see that in that Tekla Structures documentation that I was just showing before. Now, I'm going to change the product name to basically be the same name as my executable. So I'm going to say Beam Creator here. Now, what I can also do is, this is more the human readable description of it, but I'm just going to make that match. And I don't have any spaces because basically my project here, I don't want it to really have spaces in it. And so that is going to be Beam Creator. And this is my company information. So that's the manufacturer, the description. I usually put something more descriptive like this creates a beam. So actually I'll change that. So I'll just say that this creates beam. And then the last thing that we need to make sure that we change is that we need to make sure that there's this version that we're setting. This is the first version of my application, and I want you to see what I usually do here. So there's this version property here, and if I actually go in the Solution Explorer underneath my project, there's this properties. When I double click on that here in the tree view, you're going to see that there's this assembly information. When I click on assembly information, this is where I version my application. And so you can see here that you want this version number. Here's the primary version and the subversion. You want these to typically match the same version that you set over here in the TSEP definition file. So right now 1.0 matches essentially my properties here that I set for the version number. So this is really important to make sure that you increment when you make a new build or a new TSEP for a new version of your application. All right, so I've got that set and I've got this set here. There is only one other thing that I'm going to set in my particular template. And the first thing is if you actually studied, if you paused and kind of studied my file here, basically what I'm doing is I'm going to show the folders. It's a little bit hard to see, but really what I'm doing is these are my source paths. So right here, this is where I'm telling the XML and the TSEP builder to extract the files from my folder structure. So what that means is these folders here, which I'm going to go over in a minute. And then these are the target destinations of where to copy those files in the actual Tekla Structures installation. So it's copying my macros, my executable, any libraries, any saved settings, any default bitmaps or images. All of that stuff is going to be deployed to these appropriate folders. So up here, these are my folders of my files and my contents that I'm building and including in the TSEP itself. And then this is where the TSEP is supposed to install everything. Now, you'll notice here that I've actually got this installing into a KTS subfolder. So, this is where this is showing that all extensions should actually be deployed to the common environment into an extensions folder here. And that's what this binaries target directory is. But I have all of my content going into a KTS folder inside of there. So that way all of my tools and my extensions are actually inside of that specific folder. Some people actually deploy all of their tools and their extensions into a separate folder. So for instance, here instead of KTS, they might say, for instance, Beam Creator as an example. Now I'm going to leave this how I have it because I've got that set up in my template structure here for where the macros and everything are going to be. But I just wanted you to understand that this is where you're basically going to put your executable, and they need to be going into the common environment. Now I'm going to bounce over to the actual folder structure in Tekla Structures so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I have my Tekla Structures installed on my C drive and Tekla Structures folder, but you might have yours installed in the default directory, which is going to be in C program data, and then there's a Trimble Tekla Structures folder. But the main point here is that once you get to the Tekla Structures and in that specific version install folder, here is where we're going to go to the environments folder. Then there is the common folder, and then there is the extensions folder. And this is where you should install all of your extensions. So any programs that you're programming and creating, whether it's plugins or external applications like we're doing here, you should install these with your TSEP into this common extensions folder. And there you go. You can see my KTS folder, and there I have all of my executables and files all in one folder. Now, some other people, what they do is exactly what you're seeing here. They take the name of the extension and they actually install their extension and all the supporting files into that specific subfolder inside of this common extensions folder. I leave that up to you as far as whatever's the most appropriate to do. One advantage of doing all of the files into its own unique folder is that any dependent libraries and things like that will then be self-contained in that folder versus shared with other applications, kind of like how I've done it here with mine. All right, so I wanted you to see exactly where it is that you should be setting the installation path to all of your applications and your binaries or your files. And that is tying back here to this binaries directory as far as the destination of where that's going. And you can see that this is the common environment folder, and then there's that extension subfolder, and then again, either your application name or your company name here to target where you want those installed. Now, if I bounce back up to the top of the TSEP Definition XML file, this is where I tell it the minimum version of Tekla Structures that I can install this to. So even though I'm using the 2025 API, I'm not really using anything that's probably specific to 2025, and I could probably port this back to earlier versions because the model API has been frozen for a while, and so some of the core things that I've been calling out in this example could be backwards compatible. But not all things are, and so you need to be mindful of that. If you're using something that is deployed in the version 2025 API, you may not be able to actually call that and make this backwards compatible. Then to make it future-proof, to allow the TSEP to be installed in 2026, 2027, etc., then you just put this 2099.1, and that's pretty much going to allow it to be installed into future versions. Now, one other thing here is there's this upgrade code, and there's a GUID that is inside of here, and you actually need to make a unique GUID for each application and installer that you build. Now, I tend to also come down here and create a new GUID for the component ID itself. The help description tells you that you don't necessarily need to do it, but I do it for both. Now, the easiest way that I've done this is I actually use a tool in Visual Studio. There's an add-on that you can add into Visual Studio called Create GUID underneath your external tools. I'm not going to go through that here. I'm going to let you look that up online to figure out how to get that in here, or you could just go online and search for a GUID creator. Now, I'm going to use this Create GUID, and I'm going to say New GUID, and I'm going to say Copy to the clipboard. Now, what I do is I then open up Notepad here, and I'll just go ahead and open up a new session in Notepad, and I'll paste that GUID text in there. Now, what I want is I want to take this GUID value right here between those curly brackets. So I'm going to right-click and say Copy, and I'm going to go back into Visual Studio, and inside of those quotes, I'm going to replace that GUID with this new GUID that I just generated. Now, I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to go back to that GUID generator. I'm going to say New GUID. I'm going to press Copy. I'm going to go back to Notepad there, and I'm going to paste in this next GUID. I'm going to copy that new GUID there, and I'm going to say copy. And then I'm going to go back in here at the bottom, and I'm going to change the component ID GUID as well in between those quotes. Okay, now that I've got that set, I think I've got everything set the way I want. I'll just go ahead and save this file, or go up to File and just do Save. And then what I'll do is I'll close that down once I save that. All right, next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through the actual folder structure of the TSEP and change some of the files, and we'll get our executable into the TSEP installation path. Okay, so in my binaries folder, this is where I'm actually going to put my application, right? So I'm going to delete this placeholder that I have here, and the name of my application is called Beam Creator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this file. I'm going to rename it and take where it says application name here, and I'm going to put the actual name of my application. So Beam Creator, and then I'm going to leave this underscore component catalog. Now, if I open this up in Visual Studio, what this is actually doing is it's telling it where to show this in the Applications and Components panel over in Tekla Structures. So for instance here, I've created a KTS Tools group, and all of my extensions are going to appear under this group. That's basically what I'm starting to edit here. So here I'm going to say the application name. So I'm going to call this Beam Creator. And then this is the actual C# macro file that's going to launch this application. So I'm going to say Beam Creator. And you'll see what this macro file name means in a moment. I'm going to show you exactly where that is in the TSEP install folder path and what that C# file is there. And then down here, because this is going into my KTS tools group that I've created, there's a unique GUID for that as well. If you wanted to create a new group, again, you would use that create new GUID, assign a new group, create your own name here, and then basically you would install to your own path or your own tree in the Applications and Components panel. Now, I'm not going to cover all of it here, but if you're doing a plugin or a component that's programmed versus an external application like I'm doing now, you're going to see that this string actually changes, and you're going to need to find this for whether you're doing a plugin or a API connection or API detail or API seam. Again, this is something that's a little bit more advanced that I would cover in later things, but if you're just doing a simple external application like I'm doing here that's going to interact with Tekla externally, then you can leave this all alone. The only thing you need to change is this application name, and you're going to make that match your application name like we did above. So I'm going to say Beam Creator. So we've changed this to Beam Creator here. We have it up here for the macro name and the display name in the Applications and Components panel. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and I'll close it, and then we'll go back to the folder structure. Now, the other thing that goes in this folder is our actual executable itself. So let me go back up a folder and then go one more up, and now I'm in the main folder where my application's at. If I go to the bin folder, debug, you can see that there's my executable. Now, if there were any other DLLs or libraries that I needed that are part of my application, then I would, and they need to be there with the executable, then I would copy those as well. Now, one thing that you don't need to do is you do not need to grab this config file. And the reason is because the Tekla API DLLs will automatically be created, and that config file will be created by the TSEP installer itself, depending on which version of Tekla Structures you're installing to. So you don't need to grab that file there. So I'm just going to grab this beamcreator.exe, and I'll say copy. And let me just say one other thing. The only exception to that config file and copying that is if you actually had some dependencies of other external libraries. Maybe you might need that config file for the binding references on those assemblies. But let's just say that by default, generally, if you're just doing a pure Tekla API app, you don't need that config file. The TSEP will create it for you based on the version you're installing. But I'm going to copy this Beam Creator executable. I'll then go back up to my primary folder. I'll go into the TSEP folder, binaries, and I'll paste that there. And now both this XML file and my exe are going to be installed into that common environment, extensions folder, and then the subfolder that I want that to be installed. So there we go. Now we have the binaries done. Let's move on to the next folder. Now, I usually have a bitmap subfolder for when I'm doing plugins, and I actually need the icon to be installed into the bitmaps folder. For external applications, we don't need that because it's actually going to go in the macros folder. So that brings us to the macros folder next. Now here, this is actually the XS_macros_directory advanced option setting within Tekla Structures. And with external applications, because we're creating an EXE, and let me just remind you what that means, that's the actual application. When we build our application in Visual Studio, it's making this beamcreator.exe. That's the actual application. If we double clicked on it, it would launch our tool. Now, what we're going to do is, in order to get this application visible in Tekla and be able to launch that executable from within Tekla, what we're going to do is we're going to actually go back to the macros folder. This is a modeling macro, so we're going to go to modeling, and here you can see that there's an application name.cs or C# file, and then there's a thumbnail, just placeholder here. Now this is exactly going to be that C# name that we were just seeing in the XML file that we are editing. So I'm going to call this beam creator, and then that says .cs for C#, and this is just a macro that gets launched from within Tekla. Now I'm going to make the thumbnail image match this as well. I'm going to say beamcreator.png. So these two files have to be the same name. Now, you can edit this and change this here. I just want you to know that if you want this to scale nicely in the applications and components panel in Tekla, then you should make this a 96 by 96 pixel image. I usually make all my icons in PowerPoint, and then I just resize them and scale them down here, make sure that they're square and set them to that 96 by 96 pixels. So that way they don't need to scale, and the file size here actually stays pretty small for this thumbnail in the Tekla install. Okay, so now that we've got that there, let's double click and open up the C# file. And the reason we're going to open this up is that we're going to actually set this application name here. This is a little script or macro that is, again, here I've got this in my KTS folder. That's where it's actually launching my executable. So that executable name is what's in our binaries folder. So I'm just going to change this here to beam creator.exe. So there we go. So that's the name of that. So there's that application name. And again, it's going to go into the common environment extensions in my KTS subfolder. And so let me just make sure that this is named correctly. beamcreator.exe. It's called beam creator up there. Let me go back to my folder structure. I'll go to my TSEP, binaries, and there's that beamcreator.exe that it's actually launching. And if I actually went back into this XML file, see this beamcreator.cs, that's the macro file right here, beamcreator.cs, the C# macro file that I'm actually telling Tekla to launch in order to launch my executable. Now this seems a little bit tricky, and it is. You might need to kind of read through this a little bit. Unfortunately, this is sort of just a legacy way that external applications have been launched and appear in the Tekla interface. So you got to kind of follow this strategy here of quickly getting this visible in the applications and components panel and launching it here. But I just wanted you to see that this executable is tying back to what we saw in our binaries folder. There's that beam creator exe. And then this file here itself is actually pointing to this C# macro file, which is what I'm editing here with my application name. And once I've got this set, I'm going to save that. I'm going to close this down as well. And I just want you to see that it is basically this modeling macro, that beamcreator.cs, that is launching my executable. So what am I talking about? Let me again go back to Tekla Structures. Underneath KTS tools, here's my basically my macro. And when I double click, for instance, on this, it's actually launching a macro that then calls out to launch my actual executable. So there's a Tekla macro that's getting launched first, and then when that spawns, it actually goes and opens up my executable that is in the common environment and that extensions folder. A little bit tricky, but that's actually what's going on here. Okay, so now that I've got that renamed, I'll go back up to my folder structure here, and there's no message files. Messages would be like if you had any translation files. So this is kind of more of a Tekla thing. If you were trying to create translation files for your dialog box to work in multiple languages, then you could create that translation file in here and deploy that with your installer. Now, standard files is where you could put any saved attribute settings or any default settings files. Again, we're not covering that in this very basic extension, but that's what you can do here. System folder is the same thing. So like if I want to install into the system directory, the XS system directory, and again, any saved attributes or settings, I could easily do that if I wanted to. Now that I've got that all set, there's only one other thing here, this icon PNG in the TSEP installer folder. That's again just a thumbnail that'll show up in the extensions list and the extensions manager within Tekla itself. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through the folder structure and we've renamed everything properly and copied all of the binary files in here correctly, the next thing we need to do is we need to tell the Tekla Structures application builder to actually read this XML and this folder structure and automatically build the TSEP for us. Okay, so now we need to browse to the Tekla Structures installation folder, which mine is a little bit different than probably yours by default. The default folder path installation folder location is actually in C program files, and then probably Trimble, Tekla Structures, and then the version number. I've installed my Tekla the old-fashioned way directly on the C drive, so it's faster for me to get to it. But once you get into this 2025 folder, you're going to see this bin folder here, and that's where you want to go inside of to find this application called the Tekla Extension Package Builder EXE. And I usually right-click on this, say Show More Options, and I send this as a desktop shortcut so that way I can get to this in the future, since it's a little bit tricky to find it. Now, I'm going to double-click on this and open it up. And what you do is you select the TSEP XML definition file that we've been working on back here in our TSEP folder. So I'm going to go ahead and say Select Project File, and I'm just going to go ahead and go find that folder. Now, by default, Visual Studio is actually putting all of my Visual Studio code inside of my users folder here. So I just browse to my C drive, users subfolder, and then I'm going to find my current user. This would be whatever your username is on your computer. And then if you scroll down to find source, that's probably where the default folder location for putting your code is. And then there's this repos folder, and then there's my Beam Creator, there's my Visual Studio project, there's my TSEP folder, TSEP installer, and there's the XML that I've just been editing inside of Visual Studio. And I'll press open, and there it is. It fills in the application name from the XML, the product version or the version number there based on the definition that was in the XML. And I'm just going to say create package. Now, if everything succeeds and there's no errors or any problems with the folder structure or the files between the XML and what's actually in my folder structure, you'll get this package created. Otherwise, you'll see a log message, and you can open the log file and figure out what's going on there. Now, I'm going to go ahead and close this, and I'll go back into my folder structure here, and you're going to actually see that in the output folder of my TSEP, I've told the TSEP Definition XML to output the TSEP package right here, and there it is. There's now my new TSEP, and I can double click on this to install it. Now, if I double click on the TSEP dispatcher should open up, and here's all the versions of Tekla Structures that I have installed on my computer. Now, the TSEP Definition XML, I talked about the versioning, and I set it to where it could go all the way back to 2018. If you had it set to the earliest version that it could be installed to a newer version, and you have older versions installed on your computer, they won't show up because the TSEP won't let you install it to older versions. Now, I'm just going to only select version 2025 here, and I'm going to press the import button. And that is now queuing it to be imported or installed into 2025 the next time that I actually start Tekla Structures. So I'm going to close this, and then it prompts me to ask me, do you want me to delete that TSEP or keep it? I'm going to say keep because I want to deploy this to other people's computers. So I'm just going to go ahead and say keep. And now I'm going to go ahead and go back to Tekla Structures, and I'm going to completely close it down and restart it. Now, when you queue a TSEP to be installed, where it's actually being put or copied to is this extensions folder in the installation path of Tekla Structures. So just like we were in the bin folder earlier, there's this extensions folder. And if we go inside of that, you're going to see these subfolders. The to be installed is basically the queued location where our TSEP got copied. And this is where when Tekla Structures launches, it reads this special extensions to be installed folder, and it tries to install this. Now, if there's a newer version of this TSEP already installed on the computer, then what will happen is this won't get installed, and it will move this to the canceled installations. Now, if there is an older version of the TSEP installed, then what will happen is it will uninstall the old version first, then it will actually take the new version here and install that into the application. And again, this installation process only happens when Tekla Structures is launched. Okay, now that I've restarted Tekla Structures and the extension has been installed in my 2025 folder structure, we can see here that in 2025, environments, common, extensions, and again, because I set my TSEP XML definition file to install into this KTS subfolder, here you can see that there's my executable, There's the config file automatically created by the TSEP installer to tell it which versions of the Tekla API that it's supposed to call. And that's why we didn't need to include that in our actual builder itself. And then there's the XML file that basically has it show up here in the folder structure underneath KTS tools. And I can see that macro that I'm going to go ahead and launch. So I just wanted you to see, like, full circle, this is where the installation is going. And then now I'm going to just go ahead and double click on my Beam Creator tool. And it might take a couple seconds here for the initial macro to compile, it didn't find it here, so let me find out exactly what went wrong. So if this happened to you here where the Beam Creator executable could not be found, then there was something wrong with my macro file name that isn't exactly named correctly. So let me go ahead and check that out. Okay, so let's see what mistake I made. I'm going to actually right click and open up the File Explorer for my Visual Studio project. I'll go in that TSEP, I'll go into the macro subfolder, and I'll go into modeling, and I'm going to edit that C# file or that macro file that launches my application. So here I can see the application name says Beam Creator EXE, and it looks like it's going into the correct path. I found the issue. I put EXE here for the application name, so I'm going to backspace that out because the EXE is actually already being added to the end of that down here in the actual launch path. So there we go. That was the culprit because I did see that the actual executable was being installed in the correct folder. I just had it named incorrectly here. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and then I'm going to close the file, and I'm going to go back into that folder structure. So I'll go back up to the TSEP, I'll go to my TSEP installer, and I'm going to delete out this 1.0 TSEP that got created. Now, how can I uninstall the current version without having to make a new version of the TSEP? Now, normally within Tekla Structures, to remove an existing extension, I would come up here to the Applications Components panel and go to this horizontal bars button, and there's this Manage Extensions, and I'll go to the Extension Manager. Now, usually I can do a search, for instance, for Beam Creator here, and it would show that. Now, for some reason, it's not actually showing it in the installation, and I'm not sure if it's because I had messed up that executable name. So I'm going to try to close down Tekla Structures, recreate a new build of this, and try to install it. And I'm actually going to change the version because I can't seem to find out how to uninstall this. So I'm just going to increment the version, which shows you how to do that, and then create a new build and install on top of this. So let's give that a shot. Okay, so back in Visual Studio itself, I'm going to go back to the properties here in the Solution Explorer at the upper right. I'll change the assembly information here to version 1.1. So I'll go ahead and change that. So now this is the primary and this is the subversion. I'll press OK. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this down, and I'm in this TSEP Definition XML file. So what am I talking about? Well, inside of the folder structure here, I had that TSEP folder and then the TSEP Definition XML inside of here. And this is where I put the name of my application, and we set that upgrade code earlier. And there is this version tag. So if you're creating a new version build here, you'll switch this to version 1.1, and then we'll save that TSEP definition file and close that. Now what I need to do is I need to build a new version of this. So I'm going to go ahead and say rebuild solution here, and that will build a new version of that executable into my folder structure. So if I go back in here, I'm going to go back to my Beam Creator folder, go to the bin folder, debug, and there's my new executable that was just created. Now I'm going to copy this file, then I'm going to go back into my TSEP folder, we'll then go into the binaries, and I'm going to paste and replace the version 1.0 executable with my new version 1.1 executable. And that's pretty much all I need to do from that front. Now I'm going to go back and rebuild my TSEP using this new version. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and launch the Tekla Extension Package Builder executable found in the Tekla Structures installation directory. Now notice that it remembers the previous path to my TSEP XML file, the definition XML file, and there's the product version now incremented. So I'm going to say create package. The new package has been created, and I'm just going to go ahead and exit this window or close it down, and let's go see if that new TSEP has been created. Okay, so here's my TSEP folder structure. I'll then go to the TSEP installer, output, and there's my new version 1.1. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click on this to install it. And so I'll select 2025 and I'll say import, close. I'll keep that file and I'll restart Tekla Structures. Okay, so now that we've reopened Tekla Structures, We're going to go ahead and double click on that icon, and now the tool launches because I have fixed that executable path name. So here we can say create beam, we can pick our 2 points, we can right click and interrupt, and our application is working as expected. So now you've seen full circle how to first start your project, reference the Tekla API libraries, code your application, build it, and now deploy it using a TSEP or Tekla Structures Extension Package.